Good morning and welcome to today's session on the course on History of English Language and Literature. In continuation with the previous lectures, we will be situating the emergence of English drama. In today's session, we will take a look at how a prelude to a certain kind of a prelude to William Shakespeare was being framed along with the drama of a set of people known as the University Wits. Before that, at the outset, it is very important to provide a brief overview and a quick recap of how the English drama had been progressing from the 11th century onwards. We had already noted some of those things in the previous lectures, and this will also help us situate today's lecture in a more historically relevant context. As we have noted in the previous sessions, the drama in general emerged from the classic period onwards, but we note that with the emergence of the Norman conquest, the influence of the classical drama, the influence of the Greek and Roman elements had begun to mitigate, and there was hardly any influence left when the Norman conquest began. And what we have as proper English drama is from the 11th and 12th century onwards, with a predominant liturgical element built into it. So, the influence, as the term implies, it was mostly biblical. Bible was the center and the source of all kinds of plot structures, stories, so on and so forth. They had a very strong didactic element to it, because as we noted, the plays were primarily staged in order to teach the common people the nuances of the Bible, biblical stories, biblical morality, so on and so forth. So, there were two kinds, as we noted in the earlier sessions. There were mystery plays and there were miracle plays, and the control was entirely under the church. Church had dictated what kind of plays to be staged, where to be staged, what kind of actors to be employed, so on and so forth. And by the 12th till the 13th century, we find that the structure of the play, the theme of the play, it begins to move a little away from the church, and there is an increased secularization that takes place. And at this stage, a new kind of play emerges known as the morality play. This is mostly allegorical in nature. The storyline does not exactly stick to the biblical stories. The characters are placed as particular kinds of virtues and vices, and this also had laid a foundational base to the emergence of Elizabethan drama in the centuries to come. And from there, we note that by the 14th century and in the beginning of the 15th century, a kind of drama known as interludes, they began to emerge, and this is entirely secular in nature. This is completely divorced from the biblical themes of the early centuries, and there is no kind of adherence to biblical morality or biblical plot structure. This also had seen the complete moving away from the control of the church. There is a set of trade guilds. There is a set of trade guilds which begin to take control over these drama in terms of its execution, in terms of the finances to be arranged, so on and so forth. And it is with the interludes we note that the drama becomes secular, and there is more comedy available for popular consumption. There are also social satires. This also means that there were real characters being depicted on stage, and this is, in fact, with the interludes we also note that for the first time drama begins to be staged more for the purpose of entertainment than for didactic purposes, as it used to be in the previous centuries. And with this Elizabethan drama, and with this, the English drama begins to assume a very distinct structure and a very distinct stature. We find that there are theatres which come up as physical structures to host these drama, and there are also patrons in place who fund and finance all of these actors, the execution, the other arrangements to be made, so on and so forth. At one point after the ascension of Queen Elizabeth, we begin to note that from the end of the 16th century onwards, the monarch himself or herself begins to patronize the production of these plays as well. And with these elements, we note that the proper English drama emerges from the 16th century onwards, particularly from the ascension of Queen Elizabeth, and for the same reason, this drama gets designated as Elizabethan drama also. There are a few distinctive features of English drama or Elizabethan drama as it comes to be known in the later decades. There is this tussle between the classical elements and the romantic elements, but at the same time we note that Elizabethan drama is a fine blend of the classical and the romantic Elizabethan elements put together. the drama is more secular in nature, with very little interference from the earlier theological or theocentric themes and morals. At the same time, it continues to be at the mercy of the guilds which are funding them, and also it always tries to please the monarch who is in place. And this is more English, as we would see in the later discussions. The dramatic techniques, the craft of drama, all of that which emerges from the 16th century onwards, though they sometimes had a little influence of the classical elements on them, there's a more distinctive Englishness to the kind of drama that begins to emerge. And another very significant fact is that though it gets termed as English drama, the center of action continues to be in London. And London, in fact, from the 14th and 15th century onwards, we noted that it had begun to emerge as the singular most province in the space of England. This was the center of political activity. This was the center of all kinds of religious movements which were taking place. This was also where all kinds of migration from the rural hinterlands were happening. London was beginning to emerge as the most prominent center in England. So from the 16th century, we know that London also emerges as a center of Elizabethan drama, and we do find its influence spreading to other parts of England, but throughout the discussion of the Elizabethan drama, we do not really talk about the other provinces in England. The action is centered entirely in London. And we also note that especially in the discussion of the University Wits, which we would be undertaking in today's session, we would note that any kind of participation in the dramatic enterprise that had emerged from the Elizabethan times could be made possible only when one was willing to relocate to the city of London. In the later years, there were many other sociological and historical studies also which emerged to try and understand this phenomenon, which also led to the emergence of particular kinds of cities and particular kinds of urban centers. So with this, we move on to the main element of the main topic of today's discussion, which is the University Wits. Let me introduce you to a quote from William Henry Hudson's Outline of English History. He talks about the University Wits in a very general sense and says that we must think of them mainly as a group and must be satisfied with the general assertion that each contributed something to the evolution of the drama into the forms in which Shakespeare was to take it up. Here, a couple of things are very important. Even when one is talking about the University Wits, it's important to note that their positioning in history, their positioning in the literary tradition is vis-a-vis the position that Shakespeare was to occupy at a later stage. In all dominant histories, we note this very strange kind of positioning that the University Wits occupy, and many of them in fact gloss over the contribution of the University Wits. However, in this lecture, we will be taking a very detailed look at the influence of University Wits, primarily because I consider it as extremely important to understand Shakespeare's craft and Shakespeare's dramatic technique in the later decades. In fact, many recent historians have pointed out that the University Wits were not given due attention by the scholars who began to institutionalize the study of Shakespeare from the 19th century onwards. So of late, there's a lot of attention being given to the factors which were aiding in the production of Shakespeare's drama, the factors which had helped Shakespeare to emerge in a particular fashion during the Elizabethan times. As if you remember the title of this lecture, it said A Prelude to Shakespeare. So here we begin to talk about some of the factors, literary and non-literary, which had enabled Shakespeare to emerge in the late decades. So at this point, we do not merely gloss over the University Wits, but we begin to ask this question: what was this something that led to the evolution of drama in the later decades? So we need to understand who these people collectively known as University Wits were. They were mostly playwrights, poets and pamphleteers, and they were also considered as the earliest professional writers in London. As we had noted earlier, it was very important for all of them to move to London to be of any noticeable stature, and they had been recorded in history right from the beginning as a set of people who paved the way for Shakespeare's writings and also for Shakespeare's personality to emerge in the dramatic scene of London. And also, A very important factor to be noted that they were extremely popular when Shakespeare began his career in the 1580s. Their popularity was such that they all were considered, they were very well known figures in London in the political scenario as well as in the entertainment scenario of England, and they were also producing successful plays, and they also had a lot of connection with the court. So in many ways they were quite prominent figures who in fact failed to make it really big when later the literary histories began to be written. And they were also educated men. They had university education, which made them quite distinct from many of the other playwrights of that period. In fact, all of them put together, they are also called as University Wits because of the kind of university education they received at Cambridge and Oxford. Only one of them, Thomas Kidd, was not a university educated person, some of which we will be taking a look at in a later session. And they were the literary elite of those times. They were the gentry of literature. And they also, there is evidence that they also often ridicule others who had lesser kind of academic education. And many historians now point out that they were all strongly influenced by the humanistic education, which also led them to move a little beyond the influence of academics and also engage with a certain human values in general. And the Cambridge History of English Literature has a very interesting observation about them, that they took a lot of pride in the university training which amounted to arrogance, and however this arrogance was considered as quite okay because they also contributed a lot to the literary methods of those times. So it was a very curious combination of intellectual arrogance plus a genuine kind of artistic merit. And they also had a shared history in terms of the time, location and ideas that they shared. And they were all contemporaries, but there is a lot of evidence to show that they had a lot of familiarity with each other. They were known to each other, but the details of the relationship that they shared with each other or the extent to which they collaborated, that's not much evident, but there is certainly an evidence of some collaborative work done, which we will be taking a look at in detail in this session. They all had moved from different parts of different parts of England to the city of London to pursue literary arts, theatre and writing. And writing included not just the writing of the dramatic plays, it also included a kind of pamphleteering, which was a prototype of journalism then. And they all were famous and quite notorious also at oftentimes for the controversial and argumentative pamphlets they had brought forth. The fact that makes them very distinctive is that they deliberately chose not to pursue an academic reputable career, but they wanted to be in London primarily to engage with the idea of drama and to produce drama, to act in drama, and so that kind of passionate interest was evident throughout in the way they lived their lives and also the way they composed their plays. And they were all trained, very well trained in fact in the school of classics, but they also knew what the audience really wanted. So they were willing to move towards free and flexible kind of drama. It is said about them that they breathed a new life into classical models. One of the recent historians, Pat Rogers, has got this thing to say about them. They did not bring to the public stage the academic canons of play construction. Far from it. In that sense, they were quite endearing to the common people as well, because they did not, their model of drama was not restrictive or constricted in any way, but they knew how to play to the gallery in multiple ways. And they were one of the first set of dramatists who knew that it was very important to respond to the audience, that the audience reception was important in the staging of the play and as well as in the composition. And it said about them that they made the public plays literary without making them academic. That was a rare combination in the mid-16th century, because until then the plays were seen as classical models or they had to be didactic in plays. A combination of the literary, the academic and the popular conception of play, that was a very rare combination during those times. They also are credited as one of those set of people who made classical tragedy popular, and the popular tragedy unified in construction and conscious of its aim. So they played a very important role in laying the foundations of Elizabethan drama, and also, as we noted earlier, for making it a little easier for Shakespeare to take off from them. So in that sense, the University Wits may be considered as a launch pad for Shakespeare's craft and dramatic technique. And it's also important to take a look at what pamphleteering meant in the mid-16th century. Pamphlets were the equivalent of modern magazines, and they were mostly, unlike the present ones, they were mostly the work of a single author, and sometimes one or two together collaborated to bring out a single pamphlet. And this was, some of the historians even consider them as a prototype of the modern journalism, because they always responded to contemporary affairs, political affairs, and some of them, to stay safe, even restrained from giving their own names while voicing certain controversial views. The range was very broad in these pamphlets. They included prose and poetry, and there was no particular format in which this was getting published. So all of these university wits, apart from their interest in drama, they also had a very active interest in pursuing pamphleteering and in writing and contributing to these pamphlets and making their views known to the public in general. They were also more affordable to the common people. If you remember, printing had made its way to England in 1476, and books continued to be quite an expensive affair. But pamphlets were comparatively cheaper than books. In fact, if we try to place them in the scale of publication, they were somewhere in the middle between bound books and cheap single sheets. As an aside, cheap single sheets were seen as a forerunner of the contemporary newspaper form. And these were also easy to publish and produce. They were generally produced very quickly in short press runs. So in general, it was cheaper, it was affordable, the mode of publication was less complicated as well. So who were these university wits? Yeah, I'll list down the names in no particular order, but there are different ways in which these playwrights have been talked about. Some have arranged them in a chronological fashion, some arranges them in a way in which a hierarchy is in place. But in this lecture, I have taken special care not to arrange them in a particular fashion, because it's very difficult to hierarchically place them or to state which one was more influential than the others. So in no particular order, there was Christopher Marlowe, John Lilly, George Peele, Thomas Lodge, Robert Greene, Thomas Nash, and Thomas Kitts. These are the set of people who are generally understood as the university wits. Among these, only Thomas Kidd had very little connection with the universities. The recent historian George Saintsbury points out that his connection with the universities is certainly not known. So he certainly did not go to any of the universities like Cambridge and Oxford, but he did have a sense of education which was perhaps not as good as the ones considered from Cambridge and Oxford. So there is a general assumption that Marlowe and Lilly had a very direct influence on Shakespeare, but historians do vary on this, and a detailed analysis of some of Shakespeare's plays also show that all of these had one kind or the other influence on Shakespeare. So we'll just leave it at that, and will not pursue much on what kind of influence each one of them had. And if we try to differentiate them, Marlowe, Greene, and Nash mainly went to Cambridge, and Lilly, Lodge, and Peele were Oxford graduates. So all of these people together, after their education had completed, they had moved to London for pursuing a career or pursuing a passion in drama and other related techniques. And if we note their lifetime, we also note that they were more or less contemporaries, with perhaps 3 or 4 years of difference between them. These are some of the common literary features which allows a later critic or a later historian to put them together. And this analysis largely drawn from Edward Albert's critiques of university wits. They all had a fondness for heroic themes in the sense that they loved to talk and write about the lives of great figures, great kings, great personalities, so on and so forth. And since heroic themes required a heroic treatment, they also made sure that their plays were full of vitality, long speeches, spectacle, instances of violence. But the flip side of this was that, and some of the times this overarching ambition for a heroic treatment often led to a loudness and disorder in their themes. But however, we can certainly give them certain allowances for them, they being the pioneers of this kind of drama in the mid-16th century. So any kind of heroic theme which any kind of heroic theme which deserves a heroic treatment also needs to be written in a heroic style. So there were magnificent epithets, powerful declamations, strong and sounding lines to make it look all the more spectacular. But again, the flip side of this was that this also had led to an extensive kind of abuse, bombast, mouthing, and sometimes some of those scenes even relapsed into a certain kind of nonsense. In spite of these, their kind of drama was very popular and the public really enjoyed watching them. And we find that in terms of genre, throughout the writings of Elizabethan, throughout the writings of the University Wits, we find that there is a predominance of tragedy. In fact, comedy during those times was considered as a lower species of drama. If you remember, all of these writers, they also had university education, so there was still some kind of arrogance and some kind of hierarchy about what constituted superior art and what constituted inferior art. So also in general during those times, not pertaining just to the University Wits, there was a general lack of humor, and whatever humor was available was mostly coarse and immature. And we can see that John Lilly was the only exception. He was the only one who, at least for in a very minimal way, engaged with humor in a more serious sense. Though most historians and literary critics have glossed over the University Wits and have not taken much care to talk about them in individual terms, in this lecture we will be taking a detailed look at what the contribution of each of these dramatists were. We begin with John Lilly, maybe because he was considered as the leader of the University Wits. He is also considered as the most talented and the extremely popular one among all of those put together. But at the same time, the recent critics have also realized that he was the most neglected, underappreciated and misunderstood Elizabethan playwright. So in that sense, we do not find him occupying any kind of stature in mainstream literary history, so much so that, like Hudson, they all prefer to gloss over all of them in a single stroke. And as far as his literary output is concerned, he had 7 and some of them feel 8 comedies, and they were mostly of very high stature in the sense that most of his works, Alexander, Compass, End Beyond, Galatea, so on, they all had performances scheduled within the court, and it is said that for some of these performances, the Queen herself used to attend. So that was the kind of stature that he enjoyed in the Elizabethan circles during that time, and he had mostly performed for private audience and the court. If you remember, in one of the earlier sessions, we mentioned about how there were 2 different kinds of theatres that prevailed during that time. One were the public houses, the public playhouses which were erected outside the city of London, and there were also these private playhouses which catered to a select wealthier and courtly audience. So John Lilly was a favourite of those courtly wealthy audience, and he was the first one to render an intellectual tone to comedy, because otherwise comedy was largely coarse, it was slapstick, it also even had the risk of falling into vulgarity. So he was the one who made use of clever repartees, he used puns, conceits and all kinds of verbal fireworks, and he in that sense had influenced Shakespeare a lot, and some of them even feel that John Lilly anticipated Shakespeare as far as the history of drama is concerned. And there is a significant prose romance work, Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit, which is credited to John Lilly. In fact, much of his fame in the later years rests on this single work known as Euphues, which we will be taking a closer look at when we begin to talk about Elizabethan prose. And in terms of the treatment of John Lilly's works, it was mostly the theme of culture and upbringing that he dealt with. So many feel that an understanding of John Lilly's work is very important for us to understand Elizabethan manners, Elizabethan culture, etc. And in his works, he always spoke about generosity, sacrifice, friendship over love. In that sense, thematically, we find he's quite closer to the Shakespearean plays which were getting produced a few decades later. And in that sense, Hudson also calls him as Shakespeare's first master. Here it's very important for us to note that all of these university wits, even when we discuss their individual merits, they are most often discussed in connection with Shakespeare or in terms of the influence they had on the later works of Shakespeare. But towards the end, in fact, he died poor and bitter. He gets neglected by the queen, the reasons for which is not really known, and he is also forgotten by his peers, and his reputation also had steadily declined towards the end. In fact, last public performance of his plays or his writings, it was seen in 1590. He dies in 1607, and there is this 17 years of inexplicable silence which has been a source of historical curiosity, but nothing much is known about the reasons for his steady decline. But the sad fact also remains that even after his death, where even at a much later point in the 18th and 19th centuries, when histories began to be written improper, his stature could not be reinstated much. His reputation could not be claimed back in a very different way either. Now we come to George Peele, and he was one dramatist who knew how to handle London life and how to translate it into his plays, and he also played along with the nationalist sentiments. If you remember, this was also the time when England was consolidating herself as a nation vis-a-vis France and Spain, and there was also this time when nationalist sentiments were running high. So many of his plays had a reflection of those popular sentiments of the time, and he is credited to have handled blank verse with more ease and variety. What blank verse is and what the details of those are, we will take a look at a later point. And some of his major works include The Arraignment of Paris, and this was a play which is considered to have flattered the Queen to a great extent, and in some private circles and for some university didactic purposes, the play is still performed. And the other couple of satires include David and Bathsheba, Old Wives' Tale, and Old Wives' Tale is said to have inspired The Winter's Tale, a play by Shakespeare. So we continue to see all of these writers and their significance being properly flagged and marked by how Shakespeare had to benefit from these at a later point. And he's also said to have collaborated with Shakespeare on his play Titus Andronicus, but there's very little evidence, and most of these facts are quite conjectural in nature as well. And it's said that George Peele's Chronicle of King Edward I was also a model for Shakespeare's historical plays at a later point. However, his most anthologized work is a short verse, A Farewell to Arms. If you recall, this is also the title of Hemingway's famous novel. And in fact, in this poem has been much anthologized, and this verse has been much popularized due to the ways in which it had been structured, and also more importantly for the way in which it flatters the Queen to no extent. If we can read out a couple of lines from that. Blessed be the hearts that wish my sovereign well, cursed be the souls that think her any wrong. And this was dedicated for Queen Elizabeth, and it was a popular verse during those times. It continues to be a popular one even till date. And in terms of his lifestyle, in fact, later we'll begin to notice that almost all of them had a very similar loose kind of lifestyle. He is said to have lived dangerously without any kind of discipline or morals in place, and he died of syphilis at the age of 40. So his literary output was very limited in that sense. His life and his lifestyle continues to be of more interest than perhaps his dramatic output put together. Now we come to another very important figure, Robert Greene, and his life and his general literary output is much shrouded in mystery, so much so that historians are not even able to identify a portrait of him, though he lived in the mid-16th century. So he was also educated at Cambridge and Oxford. He had the potential to become a very successful academic, they used to say, it seems. But anyway, he preferred theatre over academics, and the general gossip about him in the town speculated that he had abandoned his family in a different province and he had moved to London to pursue a career in theatre. And he is also said to have had a very flamboyant personality. And he is considered as the foremost of the University Wits in terms of the literary output and in terms of the colourful life that he enjoyed during that time. And it said about him that he was the first to publish, remained the longest, and the first to leap. And if you notice, his active period was only for just about a little more than 12 years, from 1580 to 1593. He was a prolific writer. He produced over 20 works which are credited to his own name, and there are also a set of anonymous works which are conjectured to be the productions of Robert Greene. He was in that sense the Stephen King of his day, as some of the recent historians would put it. And he was also quiet and notorious and professional in his dealings, especially in terms of his pamphlets. He had portrayed of himself as a hack writer, but many later historians find this claim quite disputed, and there's a lot of controversy about that as well. In his writings, he uses a lot of historical events and figures. He's also the first one to have introduced imaginary kind of situation in his plays, quite removed from the reality of those times. And some of his important works include James IV, Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, Grotsworth of Wit, bought with a million of repentance. We'll come back to this work, Grotsworth of Wit, shortly for its significance. And in his works, we notice that there is a mix of a variety of themes. In that sense, he was quite experimental. He dared to mix in elements which were not acceptable in the classical tradition, and also he dared to experiment in such a way that he did not even know whether the audience would accept it or not. However, we find that in his works there is a blend of love, fairy tales, history, magic, jokes, the kind of things that people normally would not dare to bring in together in a single piece, especially during those times. However, he said that he was very weak in creating dramatic characters. His craft in that sense was not very well formed, and his prose work comparatively is considered as the best. And he also is said to have done a lot of collaborative work. He collaborated with Thomas Lodge, another University Wit, and this is the production, A Looking Glass for London and England. This was also a popular satire of those times. And Robert Greene is also noted for his connection with Shakespeare in a very antagonistic way though, and he was 6 years Shakespeare's senior, and they both said to have lived and worked towards a proper career in London around the same time. And he is said to have inspired and influenced Shakespeare's plays at a later stage. However, we do not have a proper evidence in terms of the comparative dramatic output. In fact, Robert Greene is credited and more in terms of his first mention of Shakespeare, which is noted in 1592. This is in his work, in a work named Grotsworth of Wit. This was a pamphlet that Robert Greene had brought about, and here we find him discussing, without referring to Shakespeare's name, about a certain character who was becoming very popular in the dramatic scene of London during those times. And this is generally known, referred by the later historians as a display of Greene's paranoia. He is said to have deeply resented and attacked Shakespeare in his pamphlet. There is only a single mention of this. However, the term Shake scene is, historians feel that it's a mention about Shakespeare, who had arrived in London in the 1580s and had begun to rise to prominence in the 1590s. So, in 1592, Robert Greene makes this very vicious mention about Shakespeare as an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. And this was extremely significant in a historical context, because people like Robert Greene assumed that the arrival of new playwrights on the scene who were not part of the university education, they could be a threat to the survival of the likes of University Wits. So, in that sense, Robert Greene was also echoing the sentiments perhaps all of the other educated playwrights of the time shared. However, it's just another irony of history that at a later time we have devoted much of our literary history to William Shakespeare than to Robert Greene, who derided him in a different context. And he is also said to have lived disreputably. That's how Pat Rogers put it. And Edward Albert says that he lived in a sink of debauchery, and he did not enjoy much of a good reputation. That's what we recover from the current records. He's not said to have enjoyed much of a reputation during his lifetime. But about his death also, it's much shrouded in history. He is said to have disappeared at the age of 34, in the sense there are no death records available of Robert Greene. We only hear about him. In fact, even his mention of Shakespeare in 1592 in one of his pamphlets, that was one of his last public appearances, so to speak. After that, we do not hear much about him, and he is said to have died, and rather mysteriously disappeared. There's still a lot of controversies and a lot of theories about that. So, with that we move to the next person in line, Thomas Nash. Thomas Nash was educated at Cambridge. He reached London in 1586. He is said to be a born journalist. He was very active in pamphleteering. In fact, perhaps the most active of all the University Wits put together. His work, The Unfortunate Traveller, is considered as a forerunner of the contemporary novel form. And as far as his dramatic output is concerned, there are many plays which are attributed to him, but there is very little evidence to prove whether he actually wrote them or not. So, in that sense, his only surviving play is Summer's Last Will and Testament, which was produced in 1592. And he was quite familiar with the other University Wits of those times. He is said to have been close friends with Robert Greene. He collaborated with Marlowe in dramatic enterprises as well as in certain political affairs. And in fact, Greene and Nash together, Robert Greene and Nash together, they are credited with this rare distinction of launching the English periodical press. It was in fact only from the mid 16th century that England began to discover a market for a kind of new kind of journalism, a kind of serial writing. It said that the people used to look forward to the next piece of writing which was getting serialized then. So, in that sense, they were pioneers of not just the dramatic component, but more of a journalistic pamphleteering kind of writing. And one thing which makes Thomas Nash quite distinctive is the fact that he shared a patron with Shakespeare. The Earl of Southampton was Shakespeare's patron, about whom we would be talking about a little later. And Nash is also said to have helped Shakespeare with Henry IV Part 1. And some historians even believe that Nash wrote most of it. However, the entire play is in the contemporary credited to William Shakespeare alone. And as we mentioned earlier, he was said to have collaborated with Marlowe, not just in dramatic affairs, but also he led a very controversial political life. He was imprisoned for a short period after the production of his satire, Christ Tears Over Jerusalem. There is still a lot of debate over whether he actually had written it or not. However, he was prosecuted for the satirical play along with Ben Jonson, another playwright who is said to have collaborated with him. And due to these major political turmoils in his life, due to such kind of unfortunate incidents, he is said to have lived in seclusion towards the end of his age, and he dies at a very young age of 34. And this is another notable fact. During this time, there was always this risk of inviting the displeasure of authorities if one spoke about any controversial political decision of those times. And though the Elizabethan scene was far more secular and far more freer and far more spirited in many ways compared to the earlier times, we do notice that the artist's life continued to be at a risk. There was a risk of imprisonment if they had at any point antagonized any of those in power. And some historians feel that maybe this is a reason for Shakespeare distancing himself from the political scene of those periods. We do find that most of Shakespeare's plays at a later point, they are not set in London, but they are set in an imaginary location at a distant time and place. So, maybe these were the lessons that Shakespeare began to pick up from the life and the consequences of certain kinds of acts in the University Wits life. Now, we move to Thomas Lodge. He was very influential in terms of his upbringing. He was a son of a Lord Mayor of London. He is from London. He got educated at Oxford. He studied law, but however, he does not become a legal advisor of anything of that sort. He comes back to London to be an actor. He was also credited for this very voluminous and energetic pamphleteering. He is the one who responded quite boldly to Stephen Gosson's condemnation of stage plays. This is a very important moment in the history of drama in England. We shall be discussing this at a later point. And because Stephen Gosson had come up with a certain writing against the stage plays and playwrights and all kinds of people pursuing fine arts during the Elizabethan times. It was called the School of Abuse. This was in 1579, and Thomas Lodge is said to have responded quite vehemently to it, and also had invited a lot of criticism and made a lot of enemies in the process. He is said to have collaborated with Shakespeare for the writing of Henry VI. By now we notice that most of these writers, there is a little evidence of them collaborating with Shakespeare at some point or the other, but we are yet to ascertain whether part of this is how much of this is a conjecture and how much of this is true. His only surviving play, a chronicle play, it's a Wounds of Civil War, and he is not said to have been a very popular dramatist in terms of his writing, in terms of his craft, but he was more famous in the London circles for his response to Stephen Gosson. Another significant thing that makes him important in terms of his connection with Shakespeare is his play Rosalind, Euphues' Golden Legacy. This is considered to be very close to Shakespeare's play of a later period, As You Like It. And he was in fact, his life takes a very different turn towards the end, just like that happens in most of the lives of his life takes a very different turn towards the end, just like the lives of most of the University Wits. He turns to study and practice medicine from 1596 onwards, and after that we do not find any significant dramatic output from him. He is also not active in the London scene, either in terms of political pamphleteering or in terms of any kind of public appearance. There is evidence which shows that he becomes a Catholic. If you remember, England was primarily a Protestant nation from the Tudor period onwards, after Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and framed the Church of England. So, being a Catholic was a risky affair in London during that time. We find that by 1606 he is forced to flee England fearing persecution. He returns in 1610. There is some letter of evidence which is acquired by the historians. There is a letter which he had written to the ambassador of Paris thanking him for assuring a safe return to England. And he dies in 1625, and there is very little known about his life from 1610 to 1625. But compared to some of the other University Wits, the positive thing is that there are death records available which assures that he had not really disappeared into obscurity, but he just had withdrawn himself from all kind of public appearance and performances. And to sum up in this session, we took a look at the lives of Lilly, Greene, Lord, Nash and Peel, and how their dramatic output was significant in shaping the romantic drama of the period and also in influencing Shakespeare's writings at a later point. They all, we noted, had lived recklessly and passionately, but they were also not scared to respond to the times. However, the consequences proved perhaps a little more than they could handle as well. They were all highly active figures in London. They were very well known, very reputed, and so much so that their stature was considered quite high during that time. But at the same time, their lives in general, their dramatic output, their influence is also shrouded in mystery. And their reputation is also, there are multiple theories about what kind of reputation they enjoyed in London during those times. Some of them feel that the ill reputation that many of them now are credited with is the work of the later historians who wanted to somehow or the other prioritize Shakespeare and his works over the others. And that said and done, even the little output which is available of them, there are many cases of disputed authorship, and some even feel that they were all proxies for certain other court writers. So, there are different theories in fact about the life and output of the University Wits, which make them all the more interesting, especially as they are also considered as a prelude to the emergence of Shakespeare. And what makes them all the more important in terms of historical details, in terms of literary criticism, in terms of the general analysis of drama, is that they had a very profound influence on Shakespeare. If anyone does a detailed analysis of Shakespeare's play at a later point of time, it's very difficult to not to notice the kind of influence that University Wits had in his plot construction, in the way he borrowed particular kinds of themes, the way he responded to London life, so on and so forth. Yeah. So, that's all we have for today's session, and in the next session we will continue to look at the remaining University Wits and how they began to define and redefine the Elizabethan dramatic scene in the mid-16th century. Thank you for listening.